To click stream to the audience. Oh, hi. It's just telling me that the broadcast is live. So, oh, technology hasn't quite been my friend this morning. Well, this morning here in Western Australia, but welcome to the Facebook Live. One of the things that I love about our Lipedema Simplified community is the fact that we are such a wonderful resource for one another to navigate the ins and outs of both, things like lipedema and lymphedema. So we often see questions come up in our Facebook groups and, through other interactions about nutritional interventions. You've probably heard lots spoken about in the community about a ketogenic diet, an anti-inflammatory diet, all these sorts of things. So what we wanted to do was just spend a bit of time unpacking some of the various different nutritional interventions, why they work, what we can do to make them work better for us. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my general philosophy in terms of health. But just to kind of go back to the beginning and say hi, I can see Marilee's here, I can see Cheryl's here. As people kind of come in and out of the Facebook Live, hi from the other side of the world probably. Here where I am in Western Australia, but it's lovely to have an opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity that it is to share some of my functional nutrition background and understanding and overlay that with the interventions that we like to be able to use to help support things like lipedema and lymphedema. So let's get started. Some of my slides have gone a bit glitchy. That's why we're running a little bit late this morning. They look beautiful on my screen, but all of a sudden they've gone really crazy. So just ignore that picture there. You can see me on the side. I am a tertiary qualified, that means a university qualified nutritionist. I live a low carb ketogenic lifestyle myself. I have spent a lot of time over my life battling various different health ailments, including an autoimmune condition. I have tried various different interventions, but what I do know is that any time we move away from our standard Western way of eating, we reap some benefits. And then from there, various different types of interventions can continue to reap more benefits. Oh, hi, Paige. I can see you. And Juanetta, you said it's sunny, blustery Alaska. In my mind, Alaska should always be covered in snow, but I guess it is just the end of summer there. So lovely to have you here, and Leslie as well. So let's just talk a little bit more, or I'd like to share with you a little bit more about my functional nutrition framework. And the reason I do this is I think it helps us to understand why various interventions can help. So when I talk to people about what a functional nutrition approach is, I often share with them a picture of a tree. And I know this is a stylized tree, but nevertheless, if you just bear with me, our tree, as you'll see here, has a whole load of leaves. And if our tree was us, and I know we're not trees, but if our tree was us, these would be the signs and symptoms and potentially all of those labels of diagnoses that we have, all of the things that we're experiencing. And the leaves and the branches are really this underlying guidance that shows us that there's some sort of internal imbalance that's contributing to that manifestation of the leaves and branches. So, for example, I've got some written down on the slide here. Skin issues, aches and pains, thyroid conditions, fatigue, they can be diagnosed labels, or they can just be symptoms, things that we're experiencing. And I add lipedema and lymphedema to this. These are external expressions of some sort of dysfunction that's going on underneath. Now, when I talk about what's going on underneath, and I refer back to my little picture here that was much bigger on my own screen. Like I said, it's gone a bit wonky, but our tree has, in this picture, it has 3 roots. There are likely more roots to our tree, but the big ones that I see are, 1, our genes, what we got from mum and dad, grandparents, all of those sorts of things, and the way that those genes manifest. Now, we know with lipedema, there's research going on that's trying to determine which one gene, what is the one factor, and therefore what medication can we ultimately use to override this? And I think that's really positive research that's going on, but that research takes lots of time. what I typically see when I work with ladies with lipedema is when I look at the genetic profiles, and I don't do a genetic profile with everyone, but there are some cases where people are interested in this. And pretty much all of the ones I've done for ladies with lipedema, I see far more genes that suggest a person makes more inflammation than the average person, and potentially more genes that don't have such stellar ability to break down that inflammation. So we end up with more inflammation and less capacity to break that down. So overall, for the same type of issue, we're more likely to have more inflammation. So I see that particularly in this condition, but in many other conditions too. Those genes impact these sorts of things. We see a degree of dysfunctional digestion, and potentially we see some immune system overreaction as well. But these are components of the expression of these leaves and branches. Then it's not solely our genes, our digestion and immune health, because our tree has roots that are growing into soil. And those soil or terrain, whatever you like to call it, is all of the other things we do, the things that we do on a daily basis. So I'll just read through the list and add a little bit of commentary for you, but it's our nutritionist status. That is, do we have sufficiencies of various nutrients or insufficiencies of them? It also covers our food choices, like what are we eating each and every day? Are those foods triggering those inflammatory genes to make more inflammation? Are they not? We also need to think about our stress load, because this is huge. Simply having some sort of chronic condition is a stress to us, but then we have environmental stresses, life stresses, psychological stresses, all these sorts of things. We need to be well hydrated. If our plant's not well hydrated, it's going to have some issues. And I guess this is where my little analogy here breaks down a little bit, because we would want to actually be watering our plant. But if you think about it in terms of all of the things that are contributing to the growth of those leaves, being dehydrated certainly would be the one that contributes here. We want to think about our exercise capacity, how well we're sleeping. Often in our lipedema community, especially as lipedema progresses, sleep becomes more uncomfortable. I have a number of clients that tell me they sleep sitting up in like a sort of a rocker recliner, but sort of more upright, because it's the only place they can get comfortable. We're probably not going to get as stellar sleep if we're doing that. But of course, that's an adaptation that we need to make based on our circumstances. The last two here, connection with community and self-care practices. It may seem that these don't have a lot to do with our health and well-being and our overall capacity to manage our health. But one of the things that we learned during the COVID pandemic is that we need other people and we need community. And I think, that needs to be community close to us, people that we can physically interact with. But I think we've really come to appreciate things like the community of Lipedema Simplified and other online communities that are also adding a level of support to us, because we need this. We really do need the community, and taking time out from our everyday busy lives and providing some self-care, whether that's as simple as just sitting out in the sunshine and having some quiet moments, or it could be, self-care to me is catching up with a girlfriend and having a bit of a conversation and just debriefing. But whatever those self-care practices are, we need to have some of those on board. And then when we think about this tree and we think about the roots, the leaves, the branches, when we're considering particularly things like lipedema and lymphedema, there are some things that we can do that can prune around the edges. Things like manual lymphatic drainage, wearing compression, exercising in water, even dry skin brushing, using a vibration plate. All of these sorts of things are very helpful that we know with lipedema. And I'm sure many of you are already engaging in these sorts of practices, but these work at the leaves and branches level to help manage and regulate what's going on internally. If we were to think about the sorts of things that we do from these sort of roots and terrain kind of level, this is where we really try to get to the root or the crux of what's going on, and think about interventions that we can use that help address it at this underlying level. And I think with lipedema and lymphedema, we need to be doing some of both. If you said, oh, I'm just going to focus on my diet and not worry about any of the other things, I would, always say to someone, there's other things that you can be doing that make a huge difference as well. But for my capacity in all of this as a nutritionist, I particularly like talking about the nutritional interventions. And again, this is where some of my slides have gone a bit wonky, but I'm a coach with Lipedema Simplified, and the nutrition piece is really where I can help. And I hope you don't mind that I talk a little bit more about this. I can see a number of people on the call that I've talked to either on discovery calls, or have been part of our small group coaching, or have been part of some of our Lipedema Simplified programs. But what I just want to say to you is in terms of lipedema, nutrition is really important, but we also need to think about some of those other factors that I mentioned, the terrain factors. And this is where I can help work with someone if they feel like they're doing all that they know to do. It may just be that there's some other little tweaks that need to be made. And I'm not the only coach here with Lipedema Simplified. We have some physical therapists, others who can help you manage pain. We now have a life coach that's able to really help you navigate a little bit more along the lines of the mindset and the psychology of how navigate these sorts of aspects of a chronic health condition. But my piece is nutrition. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So where do we start? That's often a question that people say to me. I've recently had a diagnosis of lipedema. Where do I start? And my answer to everyone is always, it depends. It depends where you are when you're starting as to where you need to go. I usually suggest a trial of a ketogenic diet to see how a person responds, because we have so much anecdotal evidence about how this can make a difference. It seems to work at that underlying inflammatory aspect in terms of that immune system, and helps with the genetics also to lower down the level of inflammation, which we know is a really big driver in what's going on with lipedema. It's a good starting point, but it's not necessarily the end point. And I think that's really important for people to understand too. We are also biochemically and genetically unique, that often we need little minor tweaks as we go along to work out what's going to be the right intervention for us. And even then, sometimes the requirements change over time based on various other factors that are going on in our lives. But I do find we get typically the most impactful benefit in a very fast way by intervening with a ketogenic diet. And the reason for this is because I see lipedema and lymphedema as being like a perfect storm. But in particular, when we're talking about lipedema, we don't know the exact causes yet. Of course, the work with organizations like Lipedema Simplified and other organizations around the world are really trying to progress the research that's going into lipedema. But for now, we certainly believe that there's a role that insulin plays, there's a role that estrogen plays. I see more and more people that have an underlying thyroid disorder, whether it's an overt thyroid issue or just something that's subclinically. But the more I test, the more I see this with clients. I certainly believe that there's a genetic predisposition in my own family. I can almost look at the family tree and start circling people that experience this condition. We know that there's an inflammatory aspect to this, and it doesn't mean that always that the immune system's overreacting. Sometimes it can be underreacting to what's going on that's contributing to these sorts of things. We know that there's some compromise in blood vessel integrity. We know that there's some impairments of that lymphatic return. The lymphatic system, of course, is trying to return anything that needs to get processed and detoxified through the body back through to ultimately to the liver and dealt with. And we know that there's less capacity for that. And, we know that there's often a history of other sorts of complications and comorbid conditions that come with this that are also inflammatory. And so I see this as being a perfect storm. So what that means is it's just lots of these factors of, layer upon layer upon layer, that saying about the straw that broke the camel's back. We don't know which is the straw for each individual person, but I feel like there's just more and more straws laid on us. And then there's one thing that just triggers this into the growth of lipedema. What I tend to sort of talk to people, and you may have seen, if you've heard me talk before, I talk a lot about this, what I see as being a vicious cycle. All of the factors that we've just talked about come together to cause an issue where those fat cells, particularly in the, in the lower limbs, but it can be anyway, these cells start malfunctioning. They get larger and larger, and if any, probably the way I would explain it is they get irritated, and then the inflammatory components come in to try and deal with that. This inflamed tissue can ultimately become fibrotic, or like scar tissue. This scar tissue then contributes to this ongoing cycle. We get more inflammatory molecules coming in. There's potentially more hypoxia, cellular oxygen deprivation in and around these cells. This causes more damage, that invites more inflammation, that invites more immune molecules in, and we get this cycle that keeps going on. And then, of course, as we know, over time, with more and more scar tissue, that makes it harder for the lymphatics to sort of flow in and around all of these positions. So then we end up with this lipedema, which is a combination of both, and it just becomes more and more complex over time. And so the bottom line to all of this is it's not our fault. And I know Catherine is constantly sharing the message that this is not our fault. For many of us in this community, we've gone to our doctors and they've said, go home, exercise more, eat less, puts the burden and the responsibility back on us, that there must be something that you're either doing or not doing that's contributing to this. And so, I think it's really fundamental that we move beyond that and recognize there are lots of factors underlying this that are outside of our realm of ability to influence. We can't change our genetics. We can't change some of the environmental exposures that we've had over lives. We can't change the fact that we live in a Western world with so much processed food. We can't, change the past, but what we can do is think about what can we do differently moving forward so that we get more benefit out of the everyday choices that we're making. And this is why I recommend starting with keto. At least a low carb way of eating, but potentially testing out how a ketogenic way of eating can help, because we know from research that it's highly anti-inflammatory. And if you think about this vicious cycle again, inflammation is such a huge component that anything we do to reduce inflammation in the body can have profound benefits. It can help improve that blood sugar handling. We're removing or dramatically decreasing the carbohydrates, so the body doesn't have to put that blood glucose and those other things in the cells. So we're not getting that same irritation in and around the cells. We're improving lymphatic function because we're potentially eating in a different way. The inflammation's lowering is improving that, but potentially a higher fat and healthy fats that we're including in a ketogenic diet have some beautiful synergistic benefits in terms of making that lymph a little bit more fluid, and so it moves around a little bit easier. We certainly get metabolism improvements with a ketogenic diet. We become what we call metabolically flexible, which has a huge impact. Often we see quite significant body composition changes. This doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes this is, a step down the track. I often say to people, we have to get healthy for our body to feel comfortable releasing some of this stored weight, and it is a process for the body. I don't know if anyone knows how we actually lose weight, where the weight goes. If anyone wants to put a comment in the chat, some of you may have heard us talk about this, but I hear all sorts of comments from people about where the weight goes, and I'm just curious. I'm not seeing any immediate comments, so maybe I'll just respond and let you know we actually breathe it out. More than anything else, I think many people assume that we excrete it out, but yes, Becky, you're right. As we're burning this, we're actually expelling some of this weight through our breath. And this is a complex process in the body, and the body has to be doing lots of things right for this to happen. And sometimes this can take time. I also say to people, don't rely on the scales, because the scales can be a little bit unkind. They don't necessarily tell us the whole story. I like people to assess how they're feeling on a ketogenic diet based on how comfortable they feel in their clothes. And if someone emails me and says, I have a problem, my pants fell down in the supermarket today. Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I'm very sad that that would happen for you because that would be awkward. But on the other hand, that's really positive, and that can happen before you see changes on the scale. So maybe wear a belt. That's probably a good tip from here. But what we do want to be doing with a ketogenic way of eating is reducing this reliance on our Western diet, the diet that we go to the supermarket and we buy all these half-made or half-processed, goods that are in a package, and go back to eating healthy, nutritious, nutrient-dense food, because that would be feeding our body. Many of the processed, and particularly the ultra-processed foods on our supermarket shelves, are great for manufacturers, great for retailers, not so great for us. And the more we can feed and nourish our body with all of the things that it needs, the better our body's going to be able to help support us and to do all these underlying processes that we need for that. And I think that when we're thinking about a ketogenic way of eating, there are multiple different places in this vicious cycle where it starts to intervene. I've just noted Krista said, my compression suit is too large for me. I'm trying to order a smaller one. Yes, that can be something that happens as we start to make dietary changes, that even things like our compression isn't quite the right size anymore. Juanetta's just said she was in the driveway doing some touching up and her pants were down. I know it's embarrassing, but on the other hand, it's wonderful that I say to people, finally there's an intervention that's making a difference, because many in our community say to me, I have spent half my lifetime counting calories, doing all that I'm told to do, sort of busting my gut, exercising and not seeing any changes. But now they're finding that through a ketogenic way of eating, it's actually having some of these really profound benefits in terms of body composition, improvements in metabolism, feeling less achy pain, less swelling, less discomfort. So all of those things are really positive. Yes, okay. Krista's saying sometimes she thinks she's losing it through excreting. So I guess we're excreting some of the toxins and other byproducts that were in the cells, but actually in terms of where the weight goes, interestingly, that we do actually burn it and breathe it out. There's lots of really fascinating research about this. And even as a nutritionist that studied at university, we were never taught this. So, there you go. There is starting to be some research that's coming up that's showing the positive benefits of a ketogenic diet. Certainly, Leslyn and Catherine here at Lymphedema Simplified have been, the flag bearers of this way of eating, but there are others around the world that are starting to look at that. They're looking at various different nutritional interventions and seeing which ones provide the most benefit. And I think we will just start to see more and more of this. But the reality is, between the time that a research paper is published in a medical journal, by the time that gets to the doctor that we're seeing in the clinic, it can take about 20 years. And I, for one, don't want to wait 20 years for this to be validated over and over and over before it becomes something that is considered to be mainstream. I would like to think, if we're seeing anecdotal evidence, then yes, let's test this out. We ultimately are an experiment of one. How we respond to this intervention is going to be unique for each of us. So, what I would suggest to people is just give it a go. If it's something that you haven't tried, then it really is worth just testing out and seeing how you go. Now, I throw this slide in here because it's not easy to change the way that we eat. There is a learning curve, and we do need to, in many ways, I've got this next slide, turn the way that we've been taught to eat upside down. So this is a generalization of the food pyramid that many countries have adopted over the last, say, 30 or 40 years. Very grain heavy at the bottom, less dietary fat up the top. It's even saying it's okay to have, some of those cakes. And so if I turn that upside down, please don't feel that means you can have the cake most. I would like to actually cut off the top of this little diagram and say, if we were to do this, just really we're taking out those middle two layers. if we can focus the vast majority of our eating on protein, some non-starchy vegetables, and the degree of how many non-starchy vegetables a person can tolerate will be unique to them. We also need to focus on healthy fat, because one of the other things that's happened over certainly the last 50 years is we've become very, very dietary fat cautious. Many people are eating low fat this, low fat that. I know growing up, we always had skim milk in the fridge. Now, I don't know whether skim milk's something that is common in the US, but to me, it tasted like watered down, milk that had been watered down with like dishwashing liquid, dishwashing water. It was gross, but it was very much a watered down, no fat in there. It was just the thing that people were doing. And it's still on our supermarket shelves. And many that learned about nutrition years and years ago continue to focus on keeping their dietary fat to a minimum. And I guess when we're focusing on calories in, calories out, that makes sense. But we know that intervention really doesn't help with lipedema. And so what I would say to you is our bodies actually need healthy fat. Every single cell membrane in our body, so we have trillions of cells, every one of those has a membrane around the outside, and it's made from fat. If we're not eating enough dietary fat, or we're eating the wrong types of dietary fat, then we are going to end up with unhealthy cell membranes. And we already spoke a couple of slides ago about impaired in terms of like the blood supply, where it's a little bit leaky. Those capillaries tend to leak out more fluid into sort of in between the cells, that space, the extracellular matrix. We know that the lymphatics is compromised as well. How much of that is because at a cellular level, our cells are compromised? I think there's some really interesting things that we can think about there. Now, I'm just going to jump over. There were a couple of comments. Anne asked about the heaviness in the legs. I don't know, Anne, whether you've tried a ketogenic or at least a low carb intervention, but I do find it can make a huge difference to that heaviness. Often that's one of the first things that people say to me. They say, I just don't have that same degree of heaviness and aching and pain in my limbs. Krista's suggested a dry brushing. Yes, that can also be another wonderful intervention because it helps to stimulate that lymph flow. Krista's also said complex carbs. Make sure that your vitamin supplements are not synthetic. Yeah, some really interesting comments and information in here. Krista's also mentioned about vitamin D. If we're taking a vitamin D supplement, if we have it with some food that has some fats, we're going to get a lot better absorption. As a nutritionist, I'm really all about, ideally, we get the most majority of our vitamins and nutrients from the food that we eat. But there are times when people do need to take additional supplements. And I think that's some good wisdom from Krista about trying to avoid those synthetic ones. It is tricky, especially with things like vitamin C and other things that are being really encouraged in terms of intake at the moment. Most of those are manufactured or synthetic or derived from potentially ingredients that we wouldn't want to be ingesting if you knew what they were coming from. So just be mindful. There are more and more supplement companies that are making food-based supplements now. And I think that's probably a more natural way for our body to go, for sure. So what would a ketogenic diet look like? A ketogenic way of eating dramatically lowers the carbohydrates, especially those that come from sugar. That would be white sugar, things like maple syrup, some of those other sugar alternatives, things like agave, honey. They all turn into glucose and sugar in the body. So we want to be mindful of those. And we're also reducing our reliance on grains, because all of our grains, whether that's our pasta or rice, anything from wheat, they also all turn into sugar in the body. And it is that sugar that seems to be playing a role in the growth of those fat cells that are irritating them and causing all sorts of downstream issues. We also want to be eating sufficient protein for our body's needs. And I think back over the number of years that I've been a nutritionist, I see a lot of people's food diaries. In fact, I get a bit geeky about looking at people's food diaries, not because I'm nosy, but just because they really tell me how indoctrinated we've become about many of the health concerns that came up in the 80s and 90s, avoid dietary fat, don't eat too much protein, it's going to contribute to heart disease. Avoid those fats, eat more and more carbohydrates, and then often we've said, please go with whole grains. But again, even the whole grains are often refined these days. One of the things I typically see in a food diary is way less protein intake than our bodies need. And what happens when we're not eating enough protein is that our bodies don't have all of the amino acids that we need to do all these important functions. And so one of the things I like to talk to people about is about focusing on protein. Now, that can be from animal sources. Some people tolerate dairy just fine, eggs just fine. If not, then we need to talk about some other ways to navigate this, because it really is important to eat enough protein. It keeps us full. We want to include some dietary fat in here. That could be from avocados. We get it from eggs. We get it from, if we're eating ground beef, we're going to get a little bit there. And what we want to do is focus on eating a good array of different sorts of foods that are going to serve our body. Rebecca's just said in the comments, you keep cutting in and out. Oh, okay. I don't know why that would be. It is a school holiday day here where I am in Western Australia, so it may be that my kids are using some of my bandwidth. I apologize about that. Hopefully you're getting enough from what we're talking about to really be able to understand the benefits of what we would want to be doing in terms of a dietary intervention to help some of those other interventions that we're already doing for lipedema. Just seeing another couple of comments here. Juanetta's commenting about magnesium needed for D3. Yes, the body is very complex. And I think this is where it comes down to, if we're eating a nice array of food and we're eating a sufficient quantity of food, we've got good digestion, ultimately we don't necessarily want to be relying so much on supplements, but magnesium is one that many people commonly use because, interestingly, we churn through our magnesium in the stressful world that we live in. Our bodies are trying to deal with a lot more stress than maybe they have in past generations. So we may want to supplement with that, but there are certainly some forms that are better than others. And that's something too that as a nutrition coach with Lipedema Simplified, I can guide you through. I like Juanetta's suggestion about magnesium glycinate or magnesium threonate. Far better than magnesium oxide in terms of absorption and digestion. Where are we at? Okay, so when I talk about keto, and I show this slide all the time because every time I see it, it makes me giggle. This is what people think we're doing when we're eating keto. And it's no wonder that many people freak out and think, oh, my goodness, that's totally opposite to what I've been taught to eat the rest of my life. But it doesn't. Our ketogenic diet could certainly include bacon, cheese, all of these yummy sorts of things, but it can also include the plants, it can include nuts and seeds, it can include healthy sources of protein. And I always encourage people to pick the best options in terms of protein that they can source and can afford as well, because that makes a huge difference as well. Anne's just asked about a proper diet with Hashimoto's. I hope you don't mind. And I also have Hashimoto's. If I can circle back around to that at the end, we will have time for questions. And I think that probably requires a bit of a longer answer in terms of how does a ketogenic diet play into this. So what I would say is, if you haven't tried any dietary interventions or that you need support with keto, we are running a small group coaching program in September. We've been running this across the last year, and we're having some really wonderful success stories with people that have been part of our keto small group. What we do in these small groups is we have 3 hours of live coaching sessions. So they're recorded so you can listen back, but we really go into the nuts and bolts, the ins and outs of how do we do a ketogenic diet in the most health promoting way possible. We also have 3 1-hour sessions of Q&A, where again, we touch on some of these fundamental principles, and then we troubleshoot, we talk about our experiences. There's also a private Facebook group, and there's ongoing access to these recordings and access to the Facebook group beyond just the 3 weeks. But we really try to delve into how would you step into this and how do you navigate this. Some people have tested it out, and I think it's really important. I'm just going to flick through. Oh no, I think maybe I removed a slide. But what I was going to say is there are many ways to do a ketogenic intervention. And what we need to be mindful of is many of the online ones are more like this, the top picture. We do want to be doing this in the most health promoting way possible. And I really try to encourage people to do that in our small group coaching. Like I said, we're starting in September, about the 11th for me here in Australia, but for the Sunday, the 10th there for you, anyone that's in the US. I'm not quite sure. I did see someone from the UK on the call. I think that probably works out to be about midnight, which may not quite be the right sort of time frame for you. But what we do in this coaching program is we provide lots of resources. We talk about recipes. We do some assessments, and this becomes very geared to the group. Because it's just a small group of up to 6 people, it can be really tailored. Like Anne's asking, how do I do this with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and Hashimoto's? How do I navigate this? We can really talk about individual people's circumstances. And sometimes we do this anonymously. People will email the question and we'll just talk about it generally if someone doesn't want to sort of share the ins and outs of their particular health history. But it's a really good way to get a lot of good information in a short period of time. At the end of the 3 weeks, you would feel quite comfortable to step into a ketogenic experience. And I often say to people, give it a go for a certain period of time. It's always hard to think, oh, I have to change what I'm doing forever. Let's just test it out first. Let's see how you respond, see what it does to the heaviness in your limbs, see what it does to your swelling, see how you feel. If you're starting to feel much better in yourself, then that gives you the motivation to keep going. But if not, then maybe we need to tweak it. And that's where, it's helpful to have some ongoing guidance through this. So that's a little bit more about our small group coaching. If you want more information about it, the website URL is here on the screen. I'm not sure if Catherine's there in the background and she can add it to the chat. But either way, if you want more information, you just go to learnlipedemasimplified.org, and it's CC's -nutrition, and that will give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about this. And like I said, we are starting in the middle of September, so it's a great opportunity to kind of get this going under your belt, if you like, before we head into that crazy last couple of months of the year. November and December, that holiday period can be quite challenging, and it can be helpful to sort of get into a routine before then, so that you're feeling really confident in how to navigate that silly season. In fact, I don't know whether that's a saying that you have in the US, but we call the holiday season the silly season for obvious reasons. But sometimes I use my Australianisms and don't realize that not everyone else in the world understands what I'm talking about. So a couple of questions that regularly come up addressed to me when we're talking about nutrition, and that the first one is keto the only intervention that can help? And I think it's important for us to recognize that this isn't the only intervention, but it's probably the intervention that we see having the most success the most amount of time. There are many other people that are coming from various different other interventions. So a modified Mediterranean diet, and when I say modified, it becomes a bit more of a low carbohydrate Mediterranean sort of hybrid way of eating, can have some really positive benefits. And I think it's important at this point to say the degree of intervention a person needs with their lipedema very much depends on the stage of lipedema. If someone came to me and they said, I'm stage 4, I have lipolymphedema, I would be saying we need to intervene more aggressively because your mobility is being impacted. There's a lot of other things that are going on. If someone came to me at stage 1, of course, keto is certainly worth giving a try to see what it does, but maybe they have a little bit more sort of leeway in just doing more of a modified Mediterranean diet where they're sort of sitting more at a low carb level rather than a ketogenic level. And I think that's sort of an important distinction. There's also some other interventions along the lines of an autoimmune paleo diet or just an anti-inflammatory diet. But again, we have to start somewhere. This is where we sort of kick off, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's where we end. You know, if someone was to try this and at the end of 6 to 8 weeks, they said to me, I've noticed no changes, I can't stick with it, then we need to play around and find a way of intervening that someone can live with, that someone can stick with, and that's providing some benefits. But, you know, I always sort of suggest to people that we start with keto because it has the most amount of at least anecdotal evidence around it. And certainly the medical research is starting to show that they did some research last year that put like a modified Mediterranean diet and a ketogenic diet head to head in terms of what benefits did it provide to ladies with lipedema. And they saw both of them provided weight loss benefits, but the ketogenic diet provided more pain relief benefits. And I don't know about you, but, you know, pain to me is such a huge factor in this. If I can minimize pain, then that enables me to be more mobile, enables me to be more, to have greater capacity to do all the other things that I want to do. So in terms of quality of life, I see this as an important intervention. Oh, here is the question that I was referring to before. What's the trouble with internet keto? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't go with just someone that you find online that tells you about keto, but there are some nuances to ketogenic diets for lipedema in particular. And so I've worked with lots of ladies with lipedema. I've helped them navigate sort of this line between what's being sort of touted out there as beneficial and what's going to work for them. And like I said, often we have to navigate this and tweak it around the edges anyway to try and work out what's going on. And so that's what we do in our small group coaching. And that's how we really try and help support people as individuals, because like I said before, we are all experiments of one. And, you know, there is no one size fits all intervention. We do need to personalize this to us. And I think this is a good opportunity to go back to some of these questions. So Anne mentioned, what about a proper diet with lipedema, PCOS, and Hashimoto's? So in my experience, there's a number of different causes of polycystic ovarian syndrome, but the most common one is insulin resistance or trouble with blood sugar regulation. And definitely I've helped support lots of ladies with PCOS that have found a lot of benefit from moving to a lower carb and, you know, somewhere towards that ketogenic level of eating to help support their PCOS. And often when I have a lady with PCOS, I'll say, let's get your fasting insulin tested. Let's see what's going on. So get the fasting insulin and the fasting glucose tested at the same time and see what level of insulin dysregulation that we're dealing with. Now, Hashimoto's, on the other hand, many ladies with Hashimoto's find benefit from a ketogenic diet. The thing that we need to focus on is making sure a person's eating enough. Because Hashimoto's tends to come hand in hand with weight gain, as does lipedema, as does some of these other complications. We have to be careful around the body's potentially, we've potentially had a period of time when we've done a lot of yo-yo dieting in the past, and the thyroid becomes very sensitive. And any time it senses that we're not eating enough, it starts to react. And so we need to be really careful about making sure that a person is eating sufficient for their needs. And therefore, a ketogenic way of eating, or at least a low carb intervention, can be helpful for that. But I always say to my ladies with Hashimoto's, for all of the people that it's beneficial to, every now and then we come up with a person that really doesn't respond so well to a ketogenic diet. And there may be some other underlying issues that can be going on there, but the best way to test it out is really just to give it a go without thinking, gosh, I've got to change what I'm doing forever. It really would be a short-term intervention. And I would say, I would want to see someone knowing what their thyroid picture looks like before, like recent pathology, and then testing it again in a couple of months to see what's going on. Make sure that the dietary intervention hasn't change things. One of the interesting things I see is sometimes people need less medication on a ketogenic diet with Hashimoto's, and therefore some of that, if they haven't changed their medication, they're over medicated, and that can be contributing to some, heart palpitations, other sorts of things. So again, this is one of those situations, just like if someone came along with diabetes already diagnosed or high blood pressure and they're on medication, we need to think about that in terms of maybe their medications are going to need to be adjusted. So that's just one caveat to all of this. And that's something, again, that we talk about in our small group coaching, is sort of knowing what's going on with you, knowing where your current interventions are in terms of medication and what you may need to be tracking quite closely with your doctor and allowing them to help you navigate whether you're at the appropriate level of medication or not. So a couple more questions that I just saw come through. I know there's been a bit of a conversation about some supplements. There's been some conversation about things like dry skin brushing. Krista said, I'm stuck in a bariatric diet. I had a gastric bypass. The people who did this knew I had lymphedema but didn't tell me. Krista, I have heard that story many, many times. It's really challenging. Many in our medical field feel like they can only talk about their area of expertise. So a gastroenterologist that's potentially going to do your gastric bypass is only focusing on that, and they're not necessarily telling you anything else that they might be seeing. You said you're basically living keto and it's helped so much more than anything else. Absolutely. And that's what we hear. Reversing your gastric bypass, I have had a couple of people that have had that done, and it's been another massive period of adjustment. So whether that's necessary or not, that's certainly something to be discussing with your medical practitioners. But I certainly wish you luck, and I'm really glad to hear that keto has helped you so much. It's always heartwarming for us in this community to hear such positive stories about people's experience with keto. Sarah's asked, fasting with a low IgA. My question, Sarah, would be, why is your IgA low? I think there's a lot of other things that can be going on, and we certainly need to recognize that there can be some complications in our digestion that is triggering challenges with things like fasting, triggering challenges with various different dietary interventions. Sarah, you were part of our small group much earlier. If you want to put a little bit more information into our Facebook group, more than happy to have a bit of a conversation with you there about what's going on with that low IgA, and we can talk a little bit about some possible things that you can try. And that's really one of the benefits of our small group coaching, is that you have sort of access to that small group and can ask some questions. So go ahead and do that. I love the fact that here's Juanetta helping support other people, providing all sorts of interesting information. And again, this is one of the things that I love about our community, that we're all in it together and that we're all trying to help each other to find the solutions. I think we're kind of at the end of the things that I wanted to talk about, but I would love to hang around for another 5-10 minutes if anyone has any other questions that they would like to ask about nutrition and the nutrition piece of managing lipedema. We are going to do another Facebook Live next week that talks a little bit more in depth about some of the, I guess, challenges that come along with trying keto, based on our previous mindset around dietary interventions and the diet cycle that many of us have found ourselves in over many, many years. So, stay tuned and watch out for that. I think that's on the 7th of September, ahead of our small group coaching. But if there's any other questions here, we already have some registrations for that. So we have a few more spots to join if anyone wants to be part of our small group coaching. But otherwise, I would love to use the time that we have just to answer any further questions that people may have. Or is there a recording of this chat? I missed the answer on the... I don't think the chat gets recorded, Sarah. I think and often when I see a question, I will respond, oh, maybe somebody else has answered and said, yes, there is a recording of the chat. So Krista's commented about good healthy fluids beyond water with lemon and ice. I'm bored with it. So bone broth can be another. I know that in the US you're in the summer, but here in Australia we're just heading out of winter. So bone broth is another option. Drinking some of those electrolyte waters can be helpful. You've got to be careful about electrolyte drinks. Some of them do contain glucose, which obviously we're avoiding because it's just sugar. So you'd be wanting to look for one that has potentially some flavor in it so that you can have a little bit of variety. Some of the brands that I hear people talking about are Element, LMNT, I'm never quite sure. I only ever see it written. I think Keto Chow do one. They just do some drops that go in water. But there's a lot of, if you go into like a place like Whole Foods or look online, there's actually a lot of options in terms of electrolytes. You just want to be looking at the ingredients. I sometimes get surprised by products that are recommended for the keto community, but they have a lot of ingredients in them that to me are a bit questionable. So, just be mindful of the ingredients. The less ingredients, the better. Probably like you, I tend to make my own, and I just put a little bit of salt in water with some lemon juice. And if I really feel like I need a little bit of change, I may put a drop of something like some monk fruit or stevia in it. But that's my preferred electrolyte. I've just noticed, I'm looking out my front window, we're having some work done in our backyard, and they've just decided right now's the time to use some power tools just outside my window. So maybe this is the time to wind up the call today. And if there's no other questions, thank you so much for your time today. If you do have any further questions, you can always reach out to me at Carrie, so Carrie, Carrie at lipedema-simplified.org, and you're welcome to ask these for me. Oh, hi, Ko, a fellow Aussie. Nice to hear from you. Hope, like I said, this information's been helpful to you. Reach out with any other questions that you may have, and I'd love to see you as part of our small group or other future Lipedema Simplified options that we have coming up. I know we have another Heart to Heart coming up in October. We also have various other workshops. Leslyn's doing a wonderfully sounding webinar next week on genetics and lipedema, which I will be definitely waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning here in Australia to listen to. So if you haven't registered for that, please go ahead and register for that. An email was sent out in the last few days, but that would be great. Krista's just commenting coconut water mixed with some watermelon water. Yeah, just be mindful. Both coconut water and the watermelon will up the carbs, but if you can tolerate them and it gives you that little bit of variety, then that's probably a good thing. But just be mindful about the sugar in there and do kind of mentally incorporate it into what you're trying to do with your keto intervention. So lovely to spend some time with you. Thank you to everyone that was on the call.